Alara Vance moved through her small Oakhaven cottage with the quiet efficiency of a shadow. The late afternoon sun, a pale, anemic thing for May, barely pierced the grimy panes of her single window, casting long, wavering lines across the worn wooden floorboards. The air inside was cool, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp soil and something else, a subtle, almost medicinal aroma that clung to the fabrics and seemed to emanate from Alara herself. Tonight, like most nights, she was alone. Her supper, a meager portion of lukewarm, watery stew, simmered faintly on the hearth. She ladled it into a chipped ceramic bowl, the gentle clink of the spoon against the earthenware the loudest sound in the room. There was a rhythm to her solitude, a slow, deliberate pace that had become second nature over the years. She didn't rush, didn't sigh. She simply existed within the confines of her quiet life. As she sat at her small, scarred table, the silence pressed in, a familiar companion. No cheerful banter, no clatter of family dishes, no distant laughter to break the stillness. Only the occasional thump of a settling house beam, or the faint, almost imperceptible rustle of leaves against the outer wall, carried on the breeze from her overgrown garden. She ate slowly, savoring each bland spoonful, her gaze fixed on the flickering flame in the fireplace, a tiny beacon in the encroaching twilight. When she was finished, she wiped the bowl meticulously with a scrap of cloth, then folded her napkin with precise, almost ceremonial care. It was a small act, a private ritual of dignity in a life that afforded her little else. The villagers of Oakhaven, nestled deep in a secluded valley, far from the bustling cities of the coast, had long since decided Alara Vance was peculiar. They whispered about her behind cupped hands at the general store, their eyes darting towards her ramshackle cottage on the outskirts of town. Unnatural, they'd murmur, nodding towards her garden, a chaotic tangle of greens and purples that defied the neatly ordered rows of corn and wheat dominating the surrounding farmland. Just like her grandmother. Martha, the baker's wife, would cluck, her voice thick with self-righteous disapproval. Always talking to plants, they say, like a witch. Alara heard the whispers, felt the sidelong glances. They were as constant and predictable as the changing seasons. She offered no defense, no explanation. What was there to say? Their world was one of conventional wisdom and ancestral traditions, where everything had its place and deviations were met with suspicion. Her world, forged in the quiet communion with the earth, was something they could neither comprehend nor tolerate. One crisp morning, as the dew still clung to the spiderwebs strung between her fence posts, Alara discovered a small, scrawny robin. It lay near the base of her gnarled apple tree, its tiny wing bent at an unnatural angle, a feather ruffled and out of place. Most would have walked past, deeming it an unfortunate casualty of nature. But Alara knelt, her rough, calloused fingers gently probing the delicate bone. A faint whimper escaped the bird's beak. Her heart, often guarded and shuddered, felt a familiar tug. She disappeared into her cottage, emerging moments later with a collection of thin twigs, strips of soft linen salvaged from an old tablecloth, and a small, shallow dish of water. With practiced ease, her movements fluid and surprisingly gentle for such strong hands, she fashioned a makeshift splint. The robin, surprisingly docile, watched her with bright, beady eyes. As she worked, she murmured soft words, a low, soothing hum. "There, little one," she whispered, her voice a rarely heard melody. "Almost done. You'll fly again." She then crushed a few ripe, crimson berries into a paste, offering it on the tip of her finger. The robin pecked at it cautiously, then ravenously, its tiny chest vibrating with life. For a brief moment, a flicker of genuine warmth touched Alara's usually somber features. It was a fleeting interaction, unseen by any human eye, but it was a window into the deep well of compassion that lay beneath her quiet exterior. a testament to a dignity that needed no audience. Sometimes, a memory would drift through Elara's mind, unbidden and ephemeral like a wisp of smoke. It was always the same, a summer afternoon, sun-drenched and fragrant with the scent of loam and damp leaves. She was a child, no older than 5, kneeling in a garden unlike any other she had ever seen since. It sprawled, vast and untamed, a riot of colors and textures, plants reaching skyward like ancient, wise sentinels. Beside her, an elderly woman, her face a tapestry of wrinkles, her hands perpetually caked with rich, dark soil, would whisper, "Listen, little one." Her grandmother, Maeve, would say, her voice soft as a breeze through the reeds, "The earth whispers, and the plants, they remember." Elara would press her small ear to the ground, feeling the faint vibrations, believing. Maeve's eyes, deep set and knowing, would twinkle with a wisdom that transcended words. This memory, always brief, always just beyond her grasp, was the root of her own peculiar understanding, the foundation for the strange, resilient garden that now defined her. It was this very witchy grandmother, as the villagers put it, who had passed down not only an unusual legacy, but also the seeds of the isolation Elara now experienced. Oakhaven was a picture postcard village, quaint and seemingly idyllic. Its heart was the town square, dominated by a tall, whitewashed church and a general store that smelled perpetually of molasses and dried herbs. Life revolved around the harvests. Wheat fields stretched for miles, golden waves under the summer sun, and cornstalks stood tall and proud. The people of Oakhaven valued tradition, their lives governed by the rhythms of planting and reaping, passed down through generations. Change was viewed with suspicion, anything out of the ordinary with outright disdain. This was especially true for Barnaby, a burly farmer with a booming laugh and a perpetually red face, whose fields bordered Elara's property. He'd often stand at his fence line, hands on his hips, and shout across to her garden, "Still growing those weeds? Elara, you'll starve yourself before you get a proper crop out of that mess." His voice, usually meant for shouting at his oxen, carried easily across the field, amplified by Martha's eager clucking. "He's right. You know my prize-winning pumpkins are thriving. You should try some proper farming for once." "Elara," she'd call, her voice dripping with mock concern. Elara would merely turn her back, her shoulders squared, and continue her meticulous work. Among the villagers, there was one exception. Alden, the quiet, observant young man who apprenticed at the village blacksmith, often found himself watching Elara. He was a new arrival, having come from a distant town after his family's farm failed. He had no ingrained prejudices against Elara, only a quiet curiosity. He'd seen her tending to her garden in the early mornings, her movements graceful and purposeful, a stark contrast to the villagers' heavy-handed methods. He'd noticed the unusual vibrancy of her plants, even when his master, old Silas, complained about the wilting crops in their own small patch. Alden harbored a secret fascination for botany, often sketching strange leaves and flowers he found on his solitary walks. He didn't speak up against Barnaby or Martha. He was too new, too reserved, but he watched, and in his quiet observation, a flicker of respect, perhaps even awe, began to take root. He was, unknowingly, the helper, the one whose open mind might someday bridge the chasm between Elara and the village. Elara's garden was a living tapestry of the bizarre and the beautiful. While Oakhaven's fields stretched in uniform green and gold, hers was a chaotic symphony of deep emeralds, vibrant purples, and even a startling, almost metallic blue on some of the broad leaves. Her weeds, as the villagers called them, included towering stalks with bulbous roots that pulsed with a faint inner glow, and low-lying creepers with leaves like folded hands, their undersides of velvety crimson. There were plants with thorny exteriors that protected surprisingly tender fruit, and others that seemed to drink in the harsh sunlight with an almost eager thirst. They seemed to defy the very soil they grew in, thriving in patches where other crops withered and struggled. Villagers found it grotesque, proof of her oddity, never once considering the possibility that this strangeness was, in fact, an extraordinary form of resilience. As spring reluctantly ceded to summer, a subtle unease began to creep across Oakhaven. The usual gentle spring rains had been sporadic, replaced by long, dry spells. The summer sun, instead of being a benevolent life-giver, beat down with an oppressive, relentless intensity. Farmers grumbled, their voices low and worried in the tavern. Dry season, they'd say, swigging their ale. Just a bad year. But their brows were furrowed, their eyes constantly scanning the cloudless sky. Wheat stalks, usually chest-high by mid-July, were stunted, their heads drooping, their color an unhealthy pale green. Corn leaves curled inward, brittle and dry to the touch. The village well, usually abundant, began to run low, its water level dropping steadily. Alara, however, seemed to sense something deeper. In her garden, she spent hours. Her bare hands plunged deep into the rich, dark earth. She didn't merely dig or weed. She seemed to listen. She would press her ear to the ground. Her eyes closed, a faint tremor running through her fingertips as she traced the roots of her strange plants. A quiet urgency pulsed through her. She spoke to her plants in low, rhythmic tones, a language of murmurs and soft hums. She watered them sparingly, with precise, almost ritualistic care, using water collected from a hidden spring far in the hills, a source known only to her and, long ago, her grandmother. While the villagers fretted about a bad season, Alara knew, deep in her bones, that something far more catastrophic was brewing. The air was heavy with unspoken dread, and Alara, with her strange plants and silent wisdom, was the only one truly listening to the earth's desperate plea. She felt the change in the wind, the subtle shift in the earth's hum, and her quiet, solitary existence now held a new, almost desperate focus as she worked tirelessly to nurture her bizarre, resilient green charges. The oppressive heat of July settled over Oakhaven like a shroud. The usual verdant fields of wheat, once the pride of the valley, now lay bleached and brittle under the relentless sun. The cornstalks, once towering and robust, were shriveled husks, their leaves curled into dry, papery scrolls. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything, stinging the eyes and grating in the throat. The collective mood of Oakhaven, usually stoic and resilient, began to fray. Whispers of a bad harvest turned to outright murmurs of disaster. Alara Vance, however, felt a deeper, more profound shift. Her days, already consumed by the meticulous care of her unusual garden, now stretched from pre-dawn to dusk. She moved with an almost frenetic energy, her hands constantly digging, pruning, and coaxing life from the parched earth. While the rest of Oakhaven watched their conventional crops wither, her garden pulsed with an eerie, vibrant green. The strange, bulbous plants that defied categorization grew taller, their leaves unfurling to reveal intricate patterns, their roots seemingly drawing sustenance from a hidden, deeper source. This stark contrast did not go unnoticed, only further fueling the villagers' animosity. Barnaby, his face now perpetually grim and sweat-streaked, would glare across the fence, his usual bluster replaced by a simmering resentment. "Witchcraft," he'd mutter, loud enough for his few remaining farmhands to hear. His eyes narrowed at the inexplicable vibrancy of Alara's plants. That's the only explanation? The true catalyst arrived with the devastating news from the county seat. The drought, far from being a local anomaly, was widespread. Rivers were reduced to trickles, reservoirs to muddy puddles. The regional grain silos, usually overflowing, were dangerously low. The mayor, a portly man named Mr. Henderson, who typically only concerned himself with local taxes and festivals, called an urgent town meeting. The air in the packed community hall was thick with nervous chatter and the stifling heat of too many bodies. Mr. Henderson, his face pale and drawn, cleared his throat repeatedly before delivering the crushing blow. There would be no government aid, no emergency grain shipments. The harvest had failed across the entire district. Oakhaven was on its own. A collective gasp rippled through the hall, followed by a stunned silence. Then, the anger erupted. Shouts of disbelief, accusations, and desperate questions filled the air. What about our winter stores? My children will starve, Barnaby, usually the loudest, was surprisingly quiet, his face a mask of dawning horror. Martha, however, was quick to find a scapegoat. Her eyes, usually darting with gossip, now fixed on Alara, who sat quietly in the back row. Her presence largely unnoticed until now. "It's her!" Martha shrieked, pointing a trembling finger. "That unnatural garden, it's cursed us, drawing all the goodness from the soil, leaving nothing for the rest of us." The accusation, baseless as it was, ignited a spark of fear and resentment in the desperate crowd. Other voices joined Martha's, echoing her claims, their fear twisting into anger. "She never helps anyone, always keeps to herself." Alara felt the weight of their gaze, a palpable wave of hostility. Her initial reaction was a familiar urge to retreat, to disappear into the shadows, as she had done countless times before. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a drumbeat of fear. But as she listened to their desperate, panicked cries, something stirred within her. Not fear, but a flicker of something long dormant, a forgotten resolve, a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. She had always chosen solitude, chosen to avoid conflict. But this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about Oakhaven, about the survival of the very people who scorned her. The next day, the true desperation set in. Farmers stood in their fields, staring at the ruined crops, their hands hanging uselessly at their sides. The general store shelves quickly emptied of what little preserved food remained. Children, usually boisterous, played with a muted energy, their faces thin. Hunger, a cold, insidious dread, began to creep into every home. Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the situation was far direr than anyone realized. The drought was not just a passing phase. It was a profound environmental shift, a consequence of years of unsustainable farming practices that had stripped the land bare. Her grandmother, Maeve, had warned her of this. Speaking of the Earth's memory and the balance disrupted, Maeve had taught her to cultivate plants that could thrive where others withered, to coax life from resistant soil, to listen to the silent language of the land. It was a heritage Alara had always kept hidden, a source of comfort and solitude, but now it felt like a heavy burden. The knowledge that she possessed the means to alleviate their suffering, yet was reviled for it, gnawed at her. One evening, as the last vestiges of twilight faded, a sharp rap echoed on Alara's cottage door. Her heart leaped. No one ever called on her. Hesitantly, she opened it to find Alden, the young blacksmith's apprentice, standing on her porch. He clutched a small, wilting sprout in his hand, his usually quiet demeanor replaced by a look of profound concern. His clothes were dusty, his face smudged with soot. "Ms. Vance," he began, his voice surprisingly firm despite a tremor of apprehension. I saw your garden. It's different. My family's plot. Everything's dying. Even our well is almost dry. But your plants, they're thriving." He held up the wilting sprout. "This is from our last corn crop. Do you know why your plants are so resilient? Is there something you do?" Alara studied him, her gaze piercing yet not unkind. She saw no mockery in his eyes, only genuine desperation and a flicker of scientific curiosity. He wasn't like the others. He sought understanding, not condemnation. His question was a direct challenge to her lifelong reclusiveness. This was it, the point of no return. She could turn him away, cling to her solitude, and watch Oakhaven descend into famine, or she could open her world and risk everything. A deep breath filled her lungs, a mixture of the familiar earthy scent from her garden and the dusty, desperate air from the village. The silent instinct she had felt at the town meeting resurfaced, stronger now. It wasn't about being recognized. It was about responsibility. "Come in, Alden," she said, her voice raspy from disuse, but firm. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter her small, cluttered cottage. Dust motes danced in the last beams of light filtering through the window. He looked around, his eyes wide with curiosity, taking in the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the ancient, leather-bound books stacked on a makeshift shelf, the strange tools scattered on her workbench, implements for digging, testing soil, and cultivating, unlike any he had ever seen. "My grandmother taught me," Alara began, her voice gaining a quiet confidence as she spoke of Maeve. "She understood the earth better than anyone. She taught me to see what others could not, to listen to the soil, to understand its needs, its memories." She gestured towards her garden outside, visible through the window. "These plants, they are not ordinary. They are ancient varieties, forgotten by most, crossbred and cultivated over generations by my family. They are survivors. They draw moisture from deeper in the earth, and they are resistant to the blight that comes with prolonged drought. They thrive on what others consider barren." Alden listened, rapt. He recognized the earnestness in her voice, the quiet authority in her words. He had always been fascinated by how things grew, by the intricate mechanisms of nature. He had a keen, scientific mind, unusual for Oakhaven. "But how?" he pressed, his eyes alight with a thirst for knowledge. "How do they do it, and why? Why isn't anyone else doing this?" Alara's gaze softened. "Because it takes patience, Alden, and a different kind of understanding. Most farmers here only plant what they know, what their fathers planted. They don't listen to the earth's whispers. They don't see the signs until it's too late." She walked over to her workbench, picking up a handful of dark, rich soil. "This isn't just dirt, Alden. It's alive. And it remembers," she explained, not in mystical terms, but with a practical, almost scientific precision that surprised Alden. She spoke of soil composition, of nutrient cycling, of root systems that adapted to extreme conditions. She described how her grandmother had experimented with cross-pollination, blending wild, hardy native plants with ancient cultivated varieties from forgotten lineages. It was clear that while her methods seemed peculiar to the outside world, they were rooted in a deep, generational knowledge of sustainable agriculture, far beyond anything practiced in Oakhaven. Alden felt a profound shift in his understanding. What the villagers called witchcraft, he now saw as an extraordinary, almost miraculous form of horticulture. He saw not magic, but mastery. He spent hours that evening, listening to Alara, asking questions, his mind buzzing with possibilities. He sketched diagrams in his small notebook, trying to capture her explanations. His earlier desperation now mixed with a burgeoning sense of hope. He realized that Alara, the ridiculed recluse, held the key to Oakhaven's survival. He saw not a strange old woman, but a woman of immense knowledge and quiet power. He was no longer just a curious observer. He was becoming a believer. And in that moment, Alara Vance, for the first time in a very long time, felt a glimmer of hope that she might not be so alone after all. Her choice had been made. She would no longer hide. The quiet life she had cherished was irrevocably broken. But in its place, a new, daunting path had begun to unfold. She could not go back. The path of action, however fraught with peril, was now her only way forward. The sun beat down on Oakhaven with an unyielding cruelty. The air shimmered above the cracked earth, and the remaining water in the village well had dwindled to a muddy, disheartening puddle. Fear, sharp and acrid, had begun to curdle the community's stoicism into desperate anger. The children were quieter now, their eyes too large for their faces, their laughter replaced by the low rumble of empty stomachs. Alden, his mind alight with the revelations from Alara's cottage, felt a desperate urgency. He knew the village was teetering on the brink of collapse. He had spent the morning trying to explain Alara's methods to his master, Silas, the blacksmith, a man of practical sense but ingrained skepticism. Silas had merely grunted, polishing his anvil with a calloused hand. "Sounds like mumbo-jumbo to me, lad. Magic beans. We need rain, not fairy tales." Alden knew he couldn't convince the entire village with words alone. They needed to see. He found Alara in her garden, her hands deftly pruning a sprawling vine with leaves like leathery shields. The garden, bathed in the harsh sunlight, vibrated with an almost audacious vitality. It was an island of green in a sea of brown. "Ms. Vance," Alden said, his voice hesitant but firm. "The village. It's bad. People are getting desperate. If they could just see what you're doing here. Really see it." Alara straightened, her gaze distant, as if she were seeing beyond the immediate landscape. "They don't want to see Alden," she replied, her voice soft. "They want to blame." Just then, a commotion erupted from the road. Barnaby, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and fear, was leading a small, agitated group. Martha was at his side, her face pinched with self-righteous fury. They marched directly towards Alara's property, their shadows long and distorted in the afternoon light. Barnaby carried a rusty shovel, its blade glinting ominously. "There she is!" Barnaby bellowed, his voice hoarse with desperation. "The witch and her weeds, stealing all the water. She is draining the earth," Martha shrieked. "Look at her garden, lush and green, while our children go hungry. It's an abomination." Alara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. This was it. The confrontation she had always dreaded, the one she had retreated from her entire life. Her first instinct was to flee, to barricade herself in her cottage, to hide. But then she looked at Alden, standing a step behind her, his young face etched with worry but resolute. She looked at her garden, this living testament to her grandmother's legacy, to the decades of quiet labor, and a quiet defiance, a fierce protectiveness, settled over her. She would not back down. "What do you want, Barnaby?" Alara asked, her voice surprisingly steady, though a tremor ran through her hands. "What do we want?" Barnaby snarled, stepping closer, brandishing the shovel. "We want answers. We want to know how your plot thrives when ours dies. And if it's black magic, we'll put a stop to it." He took another menacing step, raising the shovel slightly. "We're going to dig up your garden, Alara, and see what unnatural things you're hiding under the soil." Alden instinctively stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Alara. "Wait, Barnaby. Listen, Ms. Vance has a different way. Her plants they're just adapted to the dry conditions. They're not stealing anything." Barnaby scoffed. "Adapted? Don't tell me what I'm seeing. Boy, you siding with the witch now." The crowd, fueled by fear and Barnaby's aggressive posturing, surged closer. Martha began to chant, "Tear it down! Tear it down!" Alara knew words would do no good. They wouldn't listen. She had to show them. She had to unveil her ability, not as a display of power, but as a desperate act to defend her garden and, perhaps, herself. "Stop!" Alara commanded, her voice suddenly clear and resonant, cutting through the din. It wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable authority that momentarily silenced the crowd. Her eyes, usually downcast, met Barnaby's with an intensity that made him falter. She walked purposefully to one of her largest plants, a towering, almost tree-like specimen with thick, silvery leaves that seemed to shimmer in the harsh light. It had a strange, bulbous root that was partially exposed above the soil. She knelt, her fingers gently touching the gnarled, rough surface of the root. The The crowd watched, a mix of apprehension and morbid curiosity. Ilara closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration. She wasn't praying or casting a spell. She was listening to the faint, deep hum of the earth, sensing the subtle flow of moisture deep beneath the parched surface. She focused, channeling a lifetime of intuitive connection, a generational understanding passed down from Maeve. She felt the plant, its intricate network of roots, its thirst, its resilience. It was a symbiotic dance, a conversation without words. Then, with a low, almost imperceptible groan, the bulbous root of the plant began to glow faintly, a soft, ethereal light pulsing from within. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The light intensified, radiating a warm, comforting luminescence that seemed to push back against the oppressive heat. Then, impossibly, a thin stream of clear, cool water began to seep from the very base of the root, trickling down into the dry, dusty earth. It wasn't a gushing torrent, but a steady, undeniable flow. The water, clean and pure, quickly formed a small puddle around the base of the plant, slowly spreading, soaking into the thirsty ground. The parched earth seemed to sigh in relief. The crowd stood stunned. Barnaby's shovel clattered to the ground. Martha's jaw hung slack. Disbelief warred with awe on their faces. They had come to accuse, to destroy, and instead, they had witnessed something miraculous. Alden, however, was not just awestruck, he was exhilarated. He had known Ilara's methods were effective, but to see this direct, tangible manifestation of her connection to the earth, it was breathtaking. He quickly dipped a finger into the spreading water, then tasted it. It was cool, sweet, and life-giving. "It's clean," he exclaimed, his voice ringing with conviction. "It's pure water." Barnaby, momentarily speechless, finally found his voice, though it was a mere croak. What is this trickery?" Ilara opened her eyes, her gaze sweeping over the shocked faces. "It's not trickery, Barnaby," she stated, her voice calm but firm. "It's what happens when you listen to the earth instead of fighting it. These plants, they are survivors. Their roots reach deep, tapping into ancient aquifers, sources of water that your shallow crops can't reach. My grandmother cultivated them for generations, for times like these." She gestured to the flowing water. "This plant, it filters the water through its roots, bringing it to the surface." A murmur went through the crowd. Some faces remained skeptical, hardened by years of prejudice, but others, particularly those with gaunt faces and desperate eyes, looked at the flowing water with a nascent glimmer of hope. Martha, ever the opportunist and now driven by a potent mix of envy and fear of losing her influence, quickly recovered. She saw the shift in the crowd, the hint of admiration for Ilara. She couldn't let that stand. "It's still unnatural," she shrieked, her voice regaining its shrill pitch. "She's hoarding just one plant. What good is that to all of us? She's keeping secrets while we starve. This is still witchery." Barnaby, seeing Martha's renewed fervor and sensing the crowd's lingering doubt, picked up his shovel again, though with less conviction. "She's right," he blustered, trying to regain control. "One plant won't save Oakhaven, and why didn't she tell us sooner she stood by while our crops died?" His jealousy, coupled with his ingrained belief that Ilara was an outsider, quickly overshadowed any awe he might have felt. He saw her knowledge not as a solution, but as a threat to his own standing and a reminder of his own failures. His competitive nature, now mixed with a desperate need to blame someone, twisted his initial fear into renewed malice. Ilara knew this reaction. It was the same narrow-mindedness, the same refusal to see beyond their own preconceived notions that had always isolated her. "I offered no secrets, Barnaby," she said, her voice laced with a quiet sadness. "You simply chose not to listen. You chose to mock what you did not understand." The initial confrontation had unveiled her unique ability, but it had also solidified the opposition. Martha and Barnaby, seeing Alara not as a savior, but as a rival for influence and a target for their desperate fear, began to plot. They would not allow her to gain the villagers' trust. They would find a way to discredit her, to expose her, to turn the villagers against her once more. The trickle of water was a powerful symbol, but it was just one plant. They would use that to their advantage. The battle for Oakhaven's future, and for Alara's place within it, had just begun. The small trickle of water from Alara's plant, a startling anomaly in the parched landscape, had ignited a fragile flicker of hope in some, but in others, particularly Barnaby and Martha, it merely intensified their fear and resentment. They saw her as a threat to their established order, a living embodiment of their own failures. The general store, usually a hub of community gossip, had transformed into a tense arena where hushed debates about Alara's miracle clashed with loud accusations of witchcraft. Barnaby, humiliated by his public display of aggression and Alara's undeniable demonstration, felt his authority among the farmers slipping. Martha, whose social standing relied on being the arbiter of village morality, saw Alara as an immediate rival. They met secretly in the dead of night, their faces illuminated by a single flickering lantern in Barnaby's barn, plotting. "It's a trick, I tell you," Martha hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "One plant. What's one plant against an entire village? She's just trying to make us beholden to her." "But the water, Martha," Barnaby countered, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "It was real. It's not enough." Martha pressed, seizing on his uncertainty. "That's the point. She wants to be the only one with the answer. We need to expose her. Show everyone that her magic is useless on a grand scale. We need a challenge. Something public. Something that proves she's just a charlatan." Barnaby's eyes narrowed. "A challenge? What kind of challenge?" Martha leaned forward, a cruel smile twisting her lips. "The old community well. It's almost dry. Isn't it? What if we challenged her to fill it, to bring water to the whole village? Not just her little patch. And we give her a deadline. If she fails, she leaves Oakhaven. Forever." Barnaby considered it. The community well was symbolic, the very heart of Oakhaven's sustenance. If Alara could truly bring water to it, she would be a hero. But if she failed, publicly and spectacularly, her influence would be shattered, and the villagers would turn on her completely. It was a risky gamble, but one that appealed to his vengeful nature. And if she succeeds, Martha scoffed. "She won't. No one can make water appear from nothing. It's physically impossible. Even if her plants draw from some deep source, they couldn't possibly generate enough to fill the entire well. She's a gardener, not a rainmaker." The next morning, Barnaby, emboldened by Martha's manipulative words and his own desperation, stood before the general store, gathering a crowd. His voice boomed through the quiet morning air. "Citizens of Oakhaven, we face a crisis. Our crops are dust. Our well almost dry. Eleanor Vance claims she has a way to bring water from the earth. Very well, we challenge her." He pointed dramatically towards the village well, a stark, dry stone cylinder in the center of the square, now a monument to their despair. "We challenge Eleanor Vance to bring enough water from her unnatural plants to fill the community well. By sundown tomorrow, if she succeeds, we will acknowledge her methods. If she fails, she must leave Oakhaven forever and take her cursed garden with her." A murmur went through the crowd. Some looked horrified by the audacity of the challenge. Others, desperate for a solution, clung to the hope it offered, however slim. The ultimatum hung heavy in the air. Alden, who had been listening from the edge of the crowd, rushed to Alara's cottage. He found her tending to her plants, seemingly oblivious to the drama unfolding in the village square. "Ms. Vance, you won't believe what Barnaby's done. He's challenged you to fill the well by tomorrow evening, or you have to leave." Alara slowly straightened, her hands still caked with soil. Her face was calm, but Alden saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a deep weariness, but also a steely resolve. "I heard him, Alden," she said, her voice quiet. "The wind carries many things." "But can you do it?" Alden asked, his voice full of doubt. "The whole well, that's immense." Ilara walked over to a cluster of her peculiar plants, their roots thick and gnarled, intertwining like ancient serpents. She touched them, her fingers tracing their contours. "My grandmother spoke of plants that could act as conduits," she murmured, almost to herself. "They tap into the deepest veins of the earth, where the water flows in abundance, untouched by the surface drought. It will take a great deal of focus, and perhaps more than one plant." This was it, the ultimate test, the gauntlet. It was not just about proving her methods. It was about her very existence in Oakhaven. The symbolic arena was the village well itself, the communal heart of their survival. She had faced ridicule and suspicion her entire life, but now the stakes were life and death, acceptance or exile, and she would face it alone. The next morning, the village square was already crowded, an expectant hush hanging in the air. People had brought stools and blankets, settling in for what promised to be either a miracle or a spectacle. Barnaby and Martha stood together, their faces grimly triumphant. Alden, though nervous, stood near Ilara's cottage, a silent beacon of support. Ilara arrived, walking slowly but purposefully towards the well. She carried nothing but a small, worn leather pouch. Her eyes scanned the assembled villagers, noting the skepticism, the desperation, the outright hostility on various faces. There was no pity, no understanding. She was utterly alone in this challenge. She began by circling the well, her gaze sweeping the dry ground around it. She was looking for something specific, a sign, a resonance in the earth. She removed small, dried roots from her pouch, burying them at precise intervals around the well's perimeter. "These," she explained to Alden in a low voice later, "were seed conductors, meant to help her connect with the underground flow." Then, she knelt beside the well, her fingers brushing the rough stones. She closed her eyes, and a profound silence fell over the square, broken only by the distant caw of a crow. Ilara took a deep, centering breath, focusing her mind. She stretched her awareness out, down, deep into the earth, searching for the ancient, underground rivers. She felt the incredible pressure, the vastness of the water reserves, but also the immense resistance of the layers of rock and compacted soil. It was like trying to hear a whisper through a mountain. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, relentless. Beads of sweat trickled down Ilara's temples. But she didn't waver. Her concentration was absolute. The villagers grew restless. Whispers started. "Nothing's happening." "Just as I thought. A hoax." Barnaby and Martha exchanged triumphant glances. Alden watched Ilara, his brow furrowed with concern. He saw the tremor in her hands, the strain on her face. He knew this wasn't magic, but an incredible exertion of will and connection to nature. He wanted to help, but he knew this was a journey she had to undertake alone. As the sun began its slow descent towards the western horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples, a wave of collective disappointment swept through the crowd. Children began to cry from thirst. Even the most hopeful faces had fallen into despair. Barnaby stepped forward, a smug look spreading across his face. "Looks like our time is almost up. Ilara," he announced, his voice loud and clear. "Any moment now." But then, Ilara's body stiffened. A faint hum, almost imperceptible at first, emanated from the ground around the well. It grew, a low vibration that thrummed through the soles of people's feet. A greenish light, faint and ethereal, began to emanate from the very roots she had buried around the well, spreading across the parched ground like a phosphorescent web. The light pulsated, mirroring the deep rhythmic breaths Ilara was now taking. The ground around the well began to tremble. A low, guttural rumble that grew steadily louder. Dust stirred, then formed small whirlpools. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Within the well itself, a faint gurgling sound began. Alara's face was contorted with effort, her entire being focused on the subterranean flow. She felt the enormous pressure building, the ancient conduits straining. This was the most difficult thing she had ever attempted, far beyond merely coaxing water from a single plant. This was about awakening an entire network, a vast, sleeping reservoir. The gurgling grew louder, a promising, hungry sound. The light around the well intensified, a vibrant, almost alien green. The air suddenly felt cooler, fresher. A collective intake of breath swept through the onlookers. Hope, once extinguished, flared again, hesitant but undeniable. But the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in its final, desperate hues. The well was still empty, only the promise of water echoing from its depths. Barnaby smirked, beginning to raise his hand to declare her failure. Martha's triumphant smile widened. Alara pushed harder, every fiber of her being screaming with exertion. She visualized the water, coaxing it, willing it upwards. She remembered Maeve's words, "The earth remembers, and it will answer, if you truly listen." The last sliver of the sun dipped below the distant hills, casting Oakhaven in an ethereal twilight. A collective groan of disappointment rose from the assembled villagers. Barnaby, his face alight with malicious triumph, raised his hand to declare Alara's failure, a cruel smirk spreading across his lips. Martha, beside him, practically vibrated with self-satisfaction. Alara, kneeling by the well, seemed to sag, her shoulders slumped, her entire body trembling with exhaustion. A profound stillness descended upon the square, a silence heavier than any accusation. Then, just as Barnaby's lips parted to deliver the final condemnation, a sound, faint at first, then growing rapidly in intensity, emanated from the depths of the well. It was a deep, resonant rumble, not of thunder, but of earth moving, of something ancient awakening. The greenish light emanating from the roots Alara had placed around the well flared, pulsing with an inner life, illuminating her strained face in an unearthly glow. The very ground beneath their feet began to vibrate, a low, powerful hum that resonated in their bones. Alara, her eyes still closed, pressed her hands harder against the dry stone of the well. She pushed, not with physical strength, but with a monumental force of will, channeling every ounce of her being, every lesson Maeve had ever taught her, into this singular, desperate act. She felt the incredible pressure building below, the resistance of the ancient rock, the slow, ponderous movement of the earth's hidden veins. She visualized the water, an underground river, immense and powerful, struggling to find its way through the narrow confines of the well shaft. She was a conduit, a living bridge between the thirsty world above and the abundant world below. A gasp rippled through the crowd as a geyser of water, dark at first, then rapidly clearing to a pristine, sparkling cascade, erupted from the well. It shot upwards with an incredible force, a liquid column reaching for the darkening sky, before arching gracefully and plunging back down into the dry basin with a magnificent roar. The sound was deafening, a symphony of triumph and deliverance. Water splashed over the rim, cool and clear, washing over the dusty ground, creating instant rivulets that snaked through the parched earth. The air, minutes before thick with dust and despair, was now filled with the sweet, refreshing scent of rain after a long drought. A primal aroma of life. The villagers were stunned into absolute silence. Faces that had been etched with doubt and mockery slowly transformed. Barnaby's jaw dropped, his hand frozen in midair. Martha's triumphant sneer dissolved into utter shock, her eyes wide with disbelief. Children, initially startled by the sudden deluge, tentatively stretched out their hands, letting the cool water wash over their small, grimy fingers. Then, laughing with pure, unadulterated joy. Alara slowly opened her eyes. Her body trembled, exhausted, but her gaze was steady, unwavering. She saw the faces in the crowd: confusion, awe, and finally, a dawning realization. The raw, desperate hunger in their eyes was replaced by something else, a profound, almost reverent relief. They rushed forward, not with anger, but with an almost childlike wonder, touching the water, cupping their hands, drinking deeply. The communal well, once a symbol of their impending doom, was now overflowing, a magnificent fountain of life. An elderly woman, her face wrinkled and tear-streaked, knelt by the well and cupped her hands, bringing the water to her lips. She looked at Alara, her eyes filled with gratitude. It's a miracle," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Slowly, tentatively, the villagers began to approach Alara. Some offered hushed apologies. Others simply stared, their minds struggling to reconcile the witch they had scorned with the savior who had just brought forth water from the parched earth. Barnaby stood rooted to the spot, his face pale, unable to comprehend what he had witnessed. His authority, his very identity as a leader in the farming community, crumbled before his eyes. He saw the shift in the villagers' gazes, the way they now looked at Alara, not him. The shame burned through him, a searing, bitter fire. Martha, ever quick to adapt, tried to regain some semblance of control. She must have had a hidden pipe. "It's a trick," she shrieked, her voice shrill with desperation, but her words were swallowed by the joyous cries and splashing water. No one listened to her now. Her influence, once absolute, withered and died in the face of such undeniable proof. Alden, his eyes shining with pride and excitement, pushed through the crowd to Alara's side. He reached out, offering her his hand. She took it, her fingers cold and trembling with exertion. "You did it, Miss Vance," he said, his voice brimming with admiration. "You really did it." The villagers, finally breaking free from their stunned silence, erupted into a chaotic chorus of cheers. They surged towards Alara, no longer with suspicion, but with a collective outpouring of awe and gratitude. They lifted her onto their shoulders, carrying her around the well, their faces illuminated by the green glow from her roots and the shimmering cascade of water. Their cheers were deafening, a roar of vindication. "Alara, Alara, the water weaver." They chanted, their voices hoarse with emotion. It was a recognition, a profound societal embrace that she had never experienced. For the first time in her life, Alara Vance was not an outcast, but a hero. The years of mockery, the decades of isolation, evaporated in the face of this overwhelming validation. Her quiet dignity had bloomed into a radiant triumph. The roaring cheers of the Oakhaven villagers slowly subsided, replaced by the gentle sound of the well overflowing, a steady, life-giving symphony. Alara, gently lowered from the villagers' shoulders, stood amidst the newfound admiration, her heart a quiet pool of emotion she hadn't known she could feel. The years of isolation, the sting of their mockery, had begun to recede, replaced by the warmth of their collective gratitude. Barnaby stood frozen, a statue of shame and disbelief. The bustling crowd, now gathered around the well, drinking and marveling, no longer paid him any mind. His authority, built on bluster and tradition, had evaporated in the face of Alara's undeniable miracle. His farmhands, who had always followed him unquestioningly, now avoided his gaze, their loyalty shifting towards the woman who had truly saved them. The weight of his public humiliation and the realization of his terrible misjudgment pressed down on him. Later that evening, he would sit alone in his empty barn, the echoes of the villagers' cheers for Alara ringing in his ears. The next morning, too proud to face the town, but too broken to continue his charade, he quietly packed a single bag and left Oakhaven under the cloak of dawn, his prosperous farm now a stark reminder of his downfall, to be slowly repossessed by the local bank. His pride and envy had cost him everything, A fitting end for a man whose greed had blinded him to the needs of his community. Martha, meanwhile, attempted one last desperate grasp at relevance. As the initial excitement around the well began to settle, she approached Alara, a forced smile plastered on her face. "Well, Alara," she simpered, "that was quite the display. Perhaps you could show me how you do it, for the good of the village." "Of course." But her eyes, though attempting to convey sincerity, still held a glint of the old, manipulative cunning. Alara met her gaze, a profound weariness in her eyes. "It is not something that can simply be shown, Martha," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "It is a connection, a lifetime of listening." She saw through Martha's facade, recognizing the lingering pride and the inability to truly admit fault. "However," Alara continued, "if you wish to understand, truly understand, then you must first learn humility. You must learn to listen to the earth, rather than trying to control it." Martha, stung by the implied rebuke and recognizing that her old tactics would no longer work, sniffed indignantly and retreated into the anonymity of the crowd, her face a mask of thwarted ambition. Over the next few weeks, as Alara's wisdom became indispensable, Martha's once eager audience dwindled. People found her gossip hollow, her opinions irrelevant. She remained in Oakhaven, but her social standing, her very identity, withered like the parched crops of old. She was left with only her bitter pride, a shadow of her former self, a living testament to the consequences of prejudice. The overwhelming emotion in Oakhaven shifted from despair to a cautious, then soaring, optimism. The well provided abundant water for drinking and daily needs, but the fields remained barren. The solution was only partial. It was Alden, his mind buzzing with ideas, who stepped forward. "Ms. Vance," he proposed the next day, standing respectfully in her now revered garden. "The well is a start, but we still need food. Your plants. They grow where nothing else will. Could we cultivate them on a larger scale?" Alara considered it. This was the opportunity she had unknowingly craved to share Maeve's legacy, to heal the land and her community. "It will take time, Alden," she warned. "These plants grow differently. They need understanding, not just labor. They need soil that is prepared, nurtured, not simply plowed." A new council was quickly formed, replacing the old, ineffectual one. It was led by Silas, the blacksmith, a man of quiet integrity, who, having witnessed Alara's miracle, was now her staunchest advocate. He extended to Alara a formal invitation, on behalf of the village, to lead their agricultural recovery. It was an offer not just of resources, but of trust and respect, a profound acknowledgement of her unique abilities. This was her meaningful new opportunity, not just to survive, but to truly belong, to use her talents for the greater good. Alara accepted, but on her own terms. She insisted that her methods be followed precisely, that the villagers learn to work with the earth, not against it. She would teach them, and her first student, her most eager disciple, was Alden. Alden spent every waking hour in Alara's garden, learning. She showed him how to prepare the soil, how to interpret the subtle signs of the plants, how to harvest the strange, resilient vegetables that had grown unnoticed for so long. She explained the deep root systems, the symbiotic relationships with soil microbes, the natural pest resistance of her grandmother's strains. He absorbed it all like dry earth soaking up rain, his scientific mind marveling at the practical wisdom that lay beneath what others had dismissed as folklore. They had long, quiet conversations in the evenings, sitting on the porch of her cottage, the hum of her garden a constant backdrop. "It's not just about growing food, is it, Ms. Vance?" Alden mused one evening, sketching a new leaf pattern in his notebook. "It's about understanding, about respect for the earth." Alara nodded, a rare, soft smile gracing her lips. "Maeve always said the earth is a patient teacher, Alden, but a demanding one. We forgot how to listen. We forced it to give, instead of asking for its bounty. She paused, gazing at the starlit sky. This famine. It was a harsh lesson, but perhaps it was also a chance for Oakhaven to remember what truly sustains us. Alden looked at her, truly seeing her, not as the peculiar recluse, but as the wise, strong woman she was. "You saved us, Ms. Vance," he said quietly, sincerely. Alara shook her head gently. "No. Alden. The earth saved us. I merely helped it speak." Their conversation wasn't just a discussion of agriculture. It was a profound reflection on the journey they had all undertaken, the painful lessons learned, and the hard-won wisdom that would guide their future. The bond between them, forged in crisis, was now solid, a partnership built on shared respect and a common vision. 1 year later, the first rays of the morning sun painted the Oakhaven Valley in hues of gold and amber, illuminating a landscape utterly transformed. The fields that had once been barren and cracked now rippled with a vibrant, almost miraculous tapestry of greens, purples, and deep earthy reds. Not the uniform green of old, but a kaleidoscope of Alara Vance's resilient plants, thriving with an exuberant vitality. The air no longer carried the scent of dust and despair, but the sweet, rich perfume of damp soil and blossoming life. The village well still flowed abundantly, a testament to the day Alara Vance had brought forth a hidden river from the earth. Alara's cottage, once a symbol of her isolation, now buzzed with activity. Her garden, expanded tenfold, stretched across the landscape, seamlessly blending with the newly cultivated community plots. It was a living classroom, a vibrant laboratory where the villagers of Oakhaven, young and old, gathered to learn. Alara, no longer the reclusive figure, moved among them with quiet confidence, her movements purposeful, her hands still perpetually covered in the rich, dark soil she loved. Her face, once etched with a quiet sadness, now held a serene contentment, punctuated by genuine, if rare, smiles. She wore simple, practical clothes, but there was an undeniable aura of respect and quiet authority about her. Alden, now formally recognized as Alara's apprentice, was a constant presence by her side. He had grown leaner, more confident, his hands as adept with the soil as they were with metal. He was a bridge between Alara's ancient wisdom and Oakhaven's traditional ways. He helped Alara organize the planting schedules, advised on crop rotation with Alara's unique species, and meticulously documented their progress. He maintained the tools, adapting them where necessary for Alara's specific needs, and tirelessly shared his newfound knowledge with the other villagers. His scientific mind, combined with Alara's intuitive understanding, had proven invaluable. The harvest that year was bountiful, not just in quantity, but in diversity. The villagers learned to prepare the new, nutrient-rich vegetables from Alara's garden, the crisp, tangy leaves of the sun-kissed thistle, the hearty, protein-packed tubers of the earth-heart root, and the sweet, purple-fleshed fruit of the twilight bloom. They discovered that these plants were not only resilient, but remarkably flavorful, and provided sustenance that their old crops could not. The famine had been a crucible, forging a stronger, more adaptive community. Alara, with Alden's help, established the Oakhaven Seed Bank and Botanical Exchange, a place where the rare, resilient seeds from her grandmother's collection were carefully stored and propagated. It became a hub for learning, attracting curious botanists and agriculturalists from distant towns, eager to learn from Oakhaven's miraculous recovery. Alara, once mocked, was now revered, sought after for her unparalleled knowledge. She didn't seek fame or fortune, merely the chance to share Maeve's legacy and ensure Oakhaven would never again face such hardship. Her greatest joy, however, came from teaching. She spent hours with the village children, her voice soft and patient, showing them how to listen to the earth, how to feel the rhythm of the soil, how to distinguish between the various plants and understand their unique properties. She saw the spark of curiosity in their eyes, the eager way they absorbed her lessons, and knew that Maeve's wisdom would live on through a new generation. She showed them how to identify the subtle signs of the plants, how to cultivate them sustainably, ensuring that Oakhaven would remain verdant for generations to come. It was her way of paying it forward, ensuring that the knowledge that had saved them would continue to nourish the community. She didn't just give them food, she gave them the knowledge to feed themselves, forever. The general store, once a place of gossip and fear, was now filled with the cheerful chatter of trade and plans for future harvests. Martha, humbled by the collective success she had so vehemently opposed, eventually sought out Alara, not with cunning, but with genuine remorse. She offered to help with the processing of the new vegetables, learning to preserve them for the winter months. Alara, always pragmatic, accepted her help, knowing that true healing came not from punishment, but from reconciliation and shared purpose. Martha, in turn, found a new sense of purpose and a quiet dignity in honest work. Oakhaven had not just recovered, it had evolved. It was no longer a village defined by its narrow traditions, but by its resilience, its adaptability, and its newfound respect for the ancient wisdom of the earth. The community, once quick to judge, had learned humility. They had seen firsthand that true strength often lay in what was different, what was overlooked, what was scorned. Alara often stood at the edge of her magnificent garden at sunset, watching the golden light bathe the vibrant leaves, listening to the contented hum of life emanating from the earth. The robin she had once saved, its wing now fully healed, often perched on her shoulder, a tiny, feathered companion. It was a picture of perfect harmony, a testament to a woman who had once been an outcast, but who had, through quiet courage and an extraordinary connection to the living world, brought forth not just water and food, but a second spring for her entire community. The unusual, resilient plants, vibrant under the setting sun, stood as a living monument to her quiet triumph, and a promise of enduring abundance for Oakhaven. If this story stirred your heart, if it reminds you that courage can alter destinies, and that light always finds a path even in the deepest darkness, please leave a comment. Share this story with those who need inspiration. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell to never miss our upcoming stories.